Come back in time with me. It's 1976. Now, if you go to a health food store, you can find some shampoo and some soap that's cruelty-free. But the only kind of color cosmetics, the only kind of makeup that anybody can get anywhere is beauty without cruelty. It's nice stuff, but it's made in the UK and it's not distributed in the US. Well, somebody needs to do it. Why not me? So I started a company, meaning I gave it a name, People's Paws. And I started importing beauty without cruelty from the UK. But the very first day when I was expecting my big shipment, I got a call from the customs office. They said, there is an irregularity. Now, I'm 26 years old, very naive. I know nothing about business. And when somebody official said irregularity, I thought, oh my God, federal prison. How will I ever get the food that I eat there? Hi, everybody. I'm Victoria Moran, host of the Main Street Vegan podcast. And People's Paws didn't last very long, but thank goodness cruelty-free cosmetics are much more widely available around the world than they were before. But it's very surprising to know that a lot of companies still do these archaic tests, and a lot of countries require them, and even those that don't allow them. At least many do. So we are going to find out in this half hour exactly what is going on there and what is being done to fix it. So I am so happy to be welcoming our guest, Monica Engebretson, and she is with Cruelty Free International. In fact, she is their head of public affairs for North America. Now, Cruelty Free International, if you're an old timer like me, you'll remember that they used to be the BUAV, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, founded in 1898. Oh my goodness, even I don't go back that far. Cruelty Free International has been working around the world to end animal testing for cosmetics, and in the US has been working at the state and federal level, and have recently welcomed the reintroduction of the Federal Humane Cosmetics Act. Welcome, Monica.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, I can't believe we are still talking about this issue. It's been one of those things, I think a little bit like fur. If you've been around a while, you can see, oh my gosh, fur is gone. Well, then it's back. And it's the same with this. So give us a little bit of the history and where we are now.
Yeah, well, I think your intro did a really good job of sort of framing the issue, because it was because of people like you back in the 70s that started asking questions about how their cosmetics were made. And then throughout the 80s, you saw campaigns really starting to come forward where consumers demanding cruelty-free cosmetics and asking questions of cosmetic manufacturers about why they were doing these tests. And so what happened during the 80s is that while you saw a bunch more cruelty-free companies come out and start marketing their products and, not using the animal tests and filling that niche market, but you also saw companies investing in new alternatives that didn't require animals. So modern technologies, they started investing in that. And we're seeing the benefits of those two things come together now, where I think we will see an end to cosmetics testing for animals in our lifetime. And the two things are really the science and the passion have joined together right now, where we're actually making a lot of headway on this issue now.
I love that the science and the passion are also coming together with food. So yeah, a lot of progress on a lot of fronts. So what are you doing right now to make things different?
So what always follows sort of the, public policy is a combination of public opinion being at one place and then laws cementing in those moral standards that society has adopted. The two really have to go together, because in order to get a bill passed, you have to have a certain amount of public support. But in order to totally drive out something and make something a solidified line in the sand, you have to have the laws in place where it says this is no longer, we've decided this is no longer acceptable, it's no longer needed, before you can actually move on. So where we are is several countries, starting in the European Union, we had a phase-in of a ban on both the act of conducting animal tests for cosmetic purposes, as well as the sale of cosmetics that involved new animal testing. So those full bans came into place throughout the European Union in 2013. From there, the goal then was to start harmonizing regulations around the world. So it doesn't really make sense just to move animal testing to other countries, and you really have to drive it out in every economically significant country in order for it to end. So we started working around the world to start harmonizing those regulations.
What, for those who are new to this, do they need to understand about what goes on?
Yeah, so for the classic animal tests, when people think about what those are, and those were developed 70 years ago, was the only thing that was really available. And what it involved, the classic test is like an eye irritation test, where a rabbit would be restrained and the substance dripped into their eye, and then the rabbit would be monitored to see what the impact of that cosmetic ingredient had on the cornea and the eye irritation. For skin irritation, it was shaving the backs of rabbits or guinea pigs and rubbing the substance into their skin and looking for, and if the animal survived, they might be washed out. That's the term, and then used again or killed afterwards. And then the toxicity tests were about feeding the animals, the substances, and then dissecting their bodies later. These animal tests, they were never very good at predicting human response. Many of them were actually quite poor at predicting a human response, but in the very beginning of safety testing, that's what they had. The key thing is now we have new alternatives that use things like human skin cells that can be grown in the lab. You can buy kits called EpiSkin, they're made by different companies. Reconstituted human corneas or human cornea models can be used that really accurately predict what a substance will have on a human. So not only are they cruelty-free, they don't involve animal use, they are more predictive. So they're better for the consumer, and increasingly they're also cheaper. You can get the results in a day, whereas the animal tests, depending on the test, can take weeks to get the results back.
So why are some companies still doing them? It seems so archaic, not to mention cruel.
Yeah, well, more and more we are finding companies are coming around. Like for our most laws that we're working on now, we do have now the support of the Personal Care Products Council, which represents a large part of the industry. But animal testing still exists mainly because in certain countries or in certain sectors, regulations might require the animal testing, or in some cases, a company or a manufacturer of an ingredient might just feel that's the safest, quickest way to get approval for their ingredient, or it's just because it's what they've always been done. So it can happen because it's a checkbox approach to safety testing. So that's where when the law actually says, no, it's not allowed and we won't accept your animal testing data, is where you really see the change to finally drive that out.
So tell us about what you're doing. What is the Humane Cosmetics Act in the US, and how close are we to having it pass?
Right. Well, that's a good question. So the bill has been introduced starting in 2013, once after the European Union ban, we started talking to legislators in the US about doing a similar legislation for the US. So the first bill was introduced in about 2014. And it would end the act of animal testing as well as the sale of new animal tested cosmetics. So when we say new, it means from the date of enactment moving forward. There's nothing we can do about the animal tests that have already happened. That data is out there. That's in existence, but moving forward, companies would have to use the modern tests and not rely on animal testing. Federal bills take a long time. Unfortunately, the process in the US is really slow, especially on the federal level. So what we started doing is looking to the states, because very often what happens in the US is federal action is informed by state action. And that's certainly been the case with the cosmetics bills. We started working in states, and through the process of working on state legislation, we worked out some of the details. And found some common ground with industry, got around some of our biggest obstacles. And now the agreements that we've worked out in those state bills have now been put into the federal bill. And we have, once again, we talked about large parts of the industry now actually supporting the Humane Cosmetics Act, as well as our state models that we've been working on.
So tell me about a state model. I mean, is it the kind of thing that people can say, I live in XX state and I'm very proud of what it's done on cosmetic testing?
Yeah, so 8 states now have passed legislation that follow the model legislation that we worked on with the PCPC. And model legislation just says this is some legislation that has all the parts that make sense. It takes into consideration some of the complexities of the industry, like sometimes a cosmetic might have a drug in it. And drugs right now still require animal testing. We want to work on that issue, but if we're just talking about cosmetics, we have to make an exemption for certain things like that, like a drug being inside of a cosmetic. So those sorts of things are worked out in the bill. And that's where having a piece of legislation that has already been talked about, has been vetted, and has been passed in states becomes very useful, because then it makes it easier for other states to do the same thing. Of course, the whole goal is to pass a federal law, and each time a state passes, it helps create that momentum for passing the federal law. And one of the main states we're working in this year is New York, because New York would be a huge incentive to pass the humane kind. It would create a lot of momentum that we're asking for. But 8 states have now passed the legislation, and we're hoping to have New York's through this year.
Oh, that's exciting. So for those of us who are just at the drugstore wanting to buy something, I know that there are apps and there are all kinds of wonderful organizations trying to keep track of which cosmetic products are cruelty-free and which ones are also vegan. And then, you can also get into the toxicity for humans. It can get a little bit complicated. So what would you recommend for somebody wanting to be sure that at the very least they weren't harming animals with their purchases?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different labeling claims out there, and you're right, it can get really confusing. There's lots of various types of bunnies and different things that are on cosmetics products, and it can get confusing on what does that really mean. Does it mean just the finished product wasn't tested, but the ingredients were? Does it, mean that, so various things. So without going into detail or criticizing other labeling schemes that are out there, we just recommend, if you're looking on your product, look for a company that has been certified through the Leaping Bunny standard. So we run Leaping Bunny around the world, and it's also run in the US. And that's really the strongest standard that you can look for, that means they meet and exceed, the basic minimums about testing. So the final product and the ingredients are in there, and products weren't tested in order to enter foreign markets and things like that.
I think the Leaping Bunny is sort of like the Good Housekeeping seal of the 21st century. It's just, it's very recognizable, certainly for vegans and animal rights people, but even people that just have some caring. It's just so easy to look at the box and look for that. And then I know you can have the Leaping Bunny app and it goes into more detail. So thanks for that.
Yeah, and once you kind of find your brands that you like, and if somebody has a brand that they really like and like, oh, they aren't certified, it might mean that they just haven't applied. So you could reach out to that company and ask them why they aren't Leaping Bunny certified, or if they've considered it. So it lets the company know that, oh, that's something that's important. Yeah.
I always think about going to lunch with a non-vegetarian friend, and she invited a friend of hers, her college roommate, and introduced me as the vegan. And her friend said, well, I'm not vegan, but my cosmetics are. And that was a really interesting thing to know. It's like people are paying attention to some of these things, and they might be coming to a more animal honoring way of life through detoured roads, but people are getting there. And this is certainly one of those ways. So Monica, I'm always fascinated by people who make this their life's work. So tell us about you. How did you become the person that you are?
I think it's, for some people, it's an aha moment where suddenly something happens and they get involved in animal rights. Other people, it's something that was always in them, and they've always been an animal lover. I am the second kind. I have always just had an affinity for animals, was always running little campaigns as young as like 10 years old. I was making posters about adopting from the shelters and pinning them up at grocery stores. And I had a little petition going in junior high against a particular cosmetic company that I won't name now, asking them to not test on animals. And I ran my little, high school animal rights group. So it was something that was always kind of justice for animals was something that was always part of something I was interested in. I became vegetarian when I was 14, you know, all these sorts of things.
That's so cool. Where did you grow up doing all this stuff?
So I grew up in the Sierra foothills of California, and on a little farm. So, you know, I was, you know, around family members who hunted. We raised pigs for slaughter and, you know, all these things. But I was very exposed to, you know, things that now I don't agree with. But in some ways, maybe that's why I sort of became the way I was, because I also, you know, was in close contact with farmed animals and animals of every kind, and learned to know them as individuals and care about their plight.
Yes. And I think it also helps in communicating with people who are in that industry. If we're not just coming from completely outside of it, like, you know, who are you to come from this other planet and tell me how to do things? But if you've had that experience, that's very, very helpful. So speaking of talking with people who see things differently, there's this whole big cosmetics industry that has always done things the way they've always done them. And I remember back in 2012 or so, it looked like all the big companies were going cruelty-free, and then China said, no, you can't sell to us unless you're testing. And they just turned back on a dime, which has always made me very fond of the companies that have always had this kind of ethic, that have been cruelty-free from the very beginning. And yet it's also just so helpful to be able to walk into the corner store and buy what you need to buy. So tell us what the cosmetic industry's response has been to this act that you're working on in Congress and to this movement in general.
Well, it's been varied. Like you've mentioned, there's some companies that have been on board with fighting against animal testing for a long time. I mean, back in the 80s, we partnered with the BUAV, partnered with, before it was Cruelty Free International, with the Body Shop. And we've continued to work alongside the Body Shop on campaigns to end animal testing. So there were companies like that that have always kind of been on the right side of history. And then there's other companies that came around later. And like I said, they were some of the companies that invested in these alternatives. They could see the writing on the wall. So in the last 10 years, it's become a real interesting kind of turn where some of our former adversaries, we now find ourselves on the same side. And in certain cases, we're standing side by side, explaining to regulators that you don't need to require the animal tests anymore, because here we are with our scientists and their scientists showing you that the alternatives are better, and we can prove product safety without harming animals, and, you know, stop asking us for the animal testing data, you know.
It's so interesting to listen to someone like you who is deeply involved in this work and just see how slowly it goes. You know, it seems to me this should have happened years ago, but like so many other things, it's a very complex, slow-moving process, but how wonderful it's going to be able to celebrate its end. And that's something I think that we can actually see in sight. So what can individuals do? You've got all this great legislative stuff going on. What can we do at home?
Yeah, well, they can continue to do what consumers have always done, which is demanding their cruelty-free cosmetics and, you know, voting with their dollars and letting the companies that they are buying from know that it's important to them. That's, you know, really what started the whole thing. And then, of course, they can ask their legislator, their U.S. senator and their U.S. representative to become a co-sponsor of the Humane Cosmetics Act. And we have an action alert on our website where they can instantly send an email, but a phone call is really effective as well. Just make a simple phone call. They'll have a staff that'll answer their phone, and you tell them you're a constituent, this is where you live, and that you would really like your representative to become a co-sponsor of the Humane Cosmetics Act. And there's a bill in the Senate as well, so they can do that. Now, the House bill does have, I think, like 147, maybe 170 by now co-sponsors, so they might already be a co-sponsor. And so if that's the case, then you call them and thank them. It's very rare that a legislator gets thanked for doing things. They're usually being told what they're doing wrong or what people want them to do, but that can be useful too, to let them know that you're paying attention.
And do we find out on your website, which is crueltyfreeinternational.org, is that where we find out if our representatives are sponsors already?
Well, you can find an action alert, and if you want to find if they are, you can look the bill up on the federal. That's a little more of a step, but you can look it up, and it'll show the co-sponsors on the federal level. But if you call and ask, or if you send an email, sometimes they'll just email you back. They're not going to be mad that you asked them to co-sponsor a bill if they're already on. They're going to be happy that they're able to tell you that they did. You know, if that's the case, don't worry about that. And right on our homepage right now, they'll be able to find the action alert link through for the Humane Cosmetics Act, because we have a latest news piece about the New York bill, which also, if there's New Yorkers listening, they can log on and take action to ask their state legislator to support the New York Cruelty-Free Cosmetics Act.
Okay, well, I'm sitting here on Manhattan Island, so that's an action step I can take. So I know that you guys have a couple of other bills. So the one that's hearts is really long. So you can tell us what it's really called and what it's about.
Okay. Yeah, that's the Humane and Existing Alternatives to Animal Testing and Sciences Act. So we just abbreviate it to HARTS. People love acronyms, so it's the HARTS Act. And what that will do, that has to do with medical testing, like NIH-funded research. So what it will do is prioritize the use of humane alternatives in NIH-funded research, which is National Institutes of Health. It's all taxpayer-funded research. They do fund a lot of animal testing. So what the HARTS Act would do is ask that they prioritize the humane alternatives there are to animal research out there, and make sure that those methods are being used before resorting to animal tests.
So you talked about how these newer alternative methods are actually better in terms of cosmetic testing. They protect humans better as well as saving animals. I think that argument is a little bit tougher when we get into the scientific research. So how do you respond to people who say, you know, that's just where I get off, you have to do that?
Well, it's okay if they want to get off at that point, but I think that they can at least agree that when there is an alternative to the use of animals, of course it should be used. And that's definitely the case. We have many areas of research where, like, brain imaging can be used to replace invasive brain research on monkeys. You can, use MRIs, and there's many areas of human disease research like Alzheimer's and AIDS where the animal tests have almost 100% failed to give us any sort of treatments. And so we really need to be putting our money into the alternatives so that we can get faster treatments for those very important diseases, or at least use every tool in the toolbox. And many of those tools are non-animal alternatives, so we should be funding those. And anytime there is an alternative that can be used, of course, it should be used. And that's really what the HARTS Act is asking for.
Wonderful. I love how you think. Now, speaking of acronyms, we've got another one, and that is CARE. Tell us about that one.
So that one's a little easier. That's the Companion Animal Release from Experiments Act. And that one would require that any laboratory that takes money from the National Institutes of Health, so a taxpayer-funded laboratory, would have to have adoption policies in place for any dog, cat, or rabbit that is no longer used for research, so that that animal could be adopted out into a home. They're healthy and able to have a life after the lab. It would require that they have a policy in place and that they report on the number of animals that are released for adoption.
I know people who have adopted beagles because they're so docile. They're often used in experiments. And the love bond really with any adopted animal is so strong. But what I'm told about those who've been in laboratories, it's just a level of healing that most of us could never understand. So thank you for all this great work that you're doing. So in our last couple of minutes, you can look beyond cosmetics. You can look wherever you want in the whole world of human-animal relationships. What has you excited and happy right now?
Well, all the progress that we're making, this is one area that's really sort of taking off and like I said, because the science has really, once again, caught up with the passion. There's lots of good, it's a really exciting time to be working on this issue with all the new innovative science that's out there, that's not only, like I said, replacing animals, but creating new medicine, ways that we're going to have new medicines and new treatments for humans, and new ways to protect the environment without harming animals.
It must be very exciting to be working in the position that you're working in right now. I think sometimes about those craftsmen and the painters who worked on the cathedrals in Europe. And they knew that it wasn't going to be finished in their lifetime, but somebody would finish it. And one day there would be a cathedral. And I feel like so many people have worked for so long on some of these animal issues. And what you're doing now is like, yeah, you're going to do it. You're going to finish this off. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was just talking the other day how it's can be frustrating because it's animal advocacy work, or maybe any advocacy work, is like an iceberg. The piece that people see that's above the water is what's underneath it. All this work that has gone in over the years and all the different efforts is what is actually raising it above the water. But the piece that you see is just the tip. All the work underneath it, nobody sees that it's been going on all these years, is there.
Oh, well, Monica, thank you so much for all that you and your colleagues are doing. And thank you for giving us this information about ways that we can help. So everybody, isn't this wonderful? Isn't it great that some things are happening and some things are changing and we have a lot to celebrate?